be advised that this recorded webinar has been edited from its original format, which may have included a product demo. To set up a live demo or to request more information, please complete the form to the right. Or if you are currently not on CSC Global, there is a link to the website in the description of this video. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, where domain security meets the supply chain crunch. My name is Christy DeMayo-Ziegler, and I will be your moderator. Joining us today is David Barnett and Quinn Taggart. David Barnett is Head of Consultancy Brand Monitoring for CSC and provides consultancy and guidance to global customers in various industries on matters relating to online brand protection. David has been working in the brand protection industry for more than 18 years. David regularly speaks at events, contributes to articles, and is the author of the book, Brand Protection in the Online World. Quinn Taggart is a Senior Global Brand Security Advisor and assists clients in the area of online brand and cybersecurity strategy. Quinn has been with CSC for almost 20 years, and his wealth of experience and knowledge is appreciated by brand owners as he helps them to better understand their evolving asset portfolio and minimize their risk. Quinn regularly contributes by publishing articles, moderating webinars, and assists in various research papers, assembling and compiling large data sources. And with that, let's welcome David and Quinn.
Thanks, Christy. So over the last few years, we've seen supply chain issues affecting a range of different industries, often associated with the distribution of goods. We've seen this emerge as a result of a number of different real-world events. So things like the COVID pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and other political issues, so things like Brexit in the UK, can all affect supply chain, as can things like other online factors, so things like cyber attacks or other online infringements that can affect things like distribution channels and so on. The other thing we see is that many organizations these days use a wide range of different suppliers. So what that means is that provides the potential for attacks on a singular point of compromise, essentially the weakest point in the chain, and that allows bad actors to get in and allows corporate systems to be jeopardized and compromised. What can happen as a result of this is that we end up disrupting the whole network of companies and products, partners, vendors, and customers that are associated with that organization and the people they supply to and through. And overall, what we've seen is that in 2021, 3 in 5 companies have been affected by issues of this type. And that's generally due to the global nature of business and the fact that, as we've said, many of these providers will use a wide range of different service providers. So on this slide here, we can see a range of different companies who've been subject to supply chain issues and attacks in the last couple of years. And in all 4 of these cases, actually, these were as a result of either malware or other kinds of attacks associated with that, things like ransomware. In the case of SolarWinds, a big news story that many of you may have heard about, this was actually a malware attack against one of their IT products and led to 18,000 of their clients being compromised. In the case of Colonial Pipeline, in this case was a ransomware attack through an employee who was using a VPN that didn't have multi-factor authentication associated with it. What we see in general is that many of the attacks that we do see take advantage of this kind of connected network of domain names and DNS. And what this really highlights is the importance of having domain security and other general online security. One key element of that is in the use of providers, so things like registrars. The key there really is that enterprise class providers will offer a range of different security products to help protect corporate domains, which other consumer grade providers may not. So provider selection really is key. In addition to that, it's really important to have in place things like phishing protection. Phishing actually forms the basis of many ransomware and malware attacks, so that's kind of key to preventing some of the issues we've talked about here. But in addition to that, brand monitoring more generally is really important, and that can help you identify and deal with other general infringements associated with third-party activity, which can arise in response to real-world issues, as we'll see in the next couple of slides. So in this presentation, we're going to focus on a particular study we carried out looking at fake domains, by which we mean domains that contain brand names but have been registered by third parties other than the brand owner. And fake domains are kind of crucial when it comes to looking at supply chain issues and attacks for a couple of different reasons. First of all, a fake domain can very readily be used as an attack vector for a phishing attack. And as we've seen, phishing is often the basis of a subsequent malware or ransomware attack. But also, fake domains can be used for other infringement types. So they can be associated with activities such as counterfeiting, traffic misdirection, cyber squatting, and so on. And obviously, all of these things can have implications for the brand owner being targeted. So there can be things like revenue loss, reputational damage, things like customer safety issues in cases where things like substandard counterfeits are being sold, and other cybersecurity concerns. And that can be associated with things like other types of attack, like things like phishing, business email compromise, and so on. But overall, really, what we'll see, as you'll see when we come to look through the findings, is that increases in fraud and attacks associated with fake domains often follow real-world events such as things like supply chain shortages. And this is actually similar to what we saw in our recent COVID study, where we actually looked at attacks against things like vaccine brands and health organizations. And again, they really tracked the activity in when the COVID pandemic took off over the last couple of years. So in this next section, we're going to present our findings from our study of fake domain registrations. In this study, we looked at the registration of fake domains targeting two specific industries which we've seen have been affected by supply chain issues. Those industries are baby formula and semiconductors, and obviously semiconductors being relevant for the manufacture of electronic chips. The way we did this is to analyse the domains containing the names of either the top brands in each industry, and those were from a couple of studies where you can see the references at the bottom, and or relevant keywords. So for baby formula, we looked at domains containing baby together with either milk, formula or feed, and similarly for chips, we looked at semiconduct, and that will cover things like semiconductors, semiconducting and so on, or electro for electronics and so on, plus chip. And the way we did that was to take a snapshot at the end of May of this year, looking at all registered domains that have been registered between January 2021 and May 2022. So firstly, we're going to have a look at the domains relevant to baby formula, which were registered over that 17-month period. Now, there's quite a lot of information on this slide, so let me walk you through it. So the first thing to say is of all the baby formula domains that we found, 84% of those were owned by third parties, so what we would term the fake domain registrations. And if you now look at the graph on the left-hand side, you can see how those registrations tracked over time. So that graph is showing you the same period from January 2021 to May 2022. And really what you're seeing, if you look at this kind of activity on the right-hand side of that graph, is that there's a peak in registrations over the period where baby formula shortages have been an issue, so what we've seen in the news over the last few months. Looking back now at the stats on the bottom right, so this is again looking at those third-party domains, we see that 93% of those used either domain privacy services or had their whois details redacted. And that may indicate a possible attempt by the owners to hide their ownership and their identity, and that may be consistent with the domains being registered with nefarious intentions. Obviously, there are other factors going on there, so things like GDPR will mean that many whois details are missing where they would previously have been present. The second point to note is that just over a quarter of those domains were configured with MX records. So what that means is that those domains have been configured with the ability to either send or intercept emails. So again, that's an indication that maybe some of these domains, for example, may be associated with things like phishing activity. Looking at the table at the bottom right, we're showing the top three domain registrars and DNS hosting domains which are featured within that third-party data set. And you can see really the key thing to take away there is that consumer-grade registrars feature quite heavily in that domain registration set, which again is quite typical of what we see for domains that are maybe being registered for more non-legitimate use. So now we can take a look at the findings relating to domains associated with semiconductors or electronic chip manufacture. And really it's a similar sort of picture. In this case, actually 95% of the domains are owned by third parties. So, the vast majority, 19 out of 20. And again, if we look at the graph, we can see how those third-party domains registrations were tracking over time. Really, in this case, the data is a bit noisier, but really what we're seeing is that there was an ongoing period of activity throughout the whole period where things like the COVID pandemic were going on, where general supply chain difficulties have been an issue. Again, looking at the stats at the bottom right, again, we're seeing similar sorts of pictures. So nearly 80% had redacted WHOIS details. Again, around a quarter had active MX records. And again, we're seeing those consumer-grade registrars featuring amongst the providers used in that domain dataset. So on these next couple of slides, we're going to take a look at some examples of some of the live sites that were associated with those domain names, really getting a flavour of the different types of infringements that those domains were being used for. These first couple are baby formula examples. So these, again, are examples of websites where either baby formula related keywords or baby formula brand names were featured in the domain name. The one on the left is an example of an e-commerce site selling what appears to be a branded product, as you can see. So the issue here is that maybe this may be an instance of unauthorized sales or possibly counterfeit sales. It doesn't look enormously legitimate. The contact email address given is a Gmail address. So this is probably not likely to be a legitimate sort of distribution partner, but maybe someone who's selling, you know, slightly more non-legitimate goods. On the right-hand side here, we see what we would term an example of brand seeding. So this is a company offering legal services for those who want to sue the baby formula companies in response to various health issues, and they're using the baby formula brand names in their site content to try and drive traffic to that site. So this is much more an example of a reputational issues, and these sorts of things can be of real concern, particularly if the claims are defamatory. And here we have a couple of examples for the semiconductor domains. So the one on the left is a Chinese language site which is making extensive use of one of our semiconductor brand names and associated imagery, so sort of logos, product imagery, and so on. This type of thing is often seen in conjunction with misdirection or passing off, possibly could be to do with the sale of counterfeits, but almost certainly is some kind of misrepresentation of that brand. On the right-hand side, we're seeing what we would term a pure case of brand seeding or misdirection. So this was actually a domain that used a semiconductor manufacturer brand name in the domain name, but it actually redirected to a completely unrelated site. In this case, it was a kind of casino gambling related site. So really kind of trading off the kind of goodwill associated with that brand name to try and drive traffic to their own content. So in this next section, we'll be giving you some recommendations and talking about how to mitigate these risks. And for that, I'm going to pass over to Quinn.
So in making some recommendations to mediate or mitigate the risk factors involved in this sort of attack vector, if you want to call it that, the idea is to try to balance things out a little bit. And it's a three-pronged balancing act. If you can picture a triangle on a pivot, you want to try to make sure that it doesn't fall over. And the three corners of that triangle are budget, as well as, of course, looking at monitoring and enforcement, and then having a good defensive process in place. So utilizing a robust brand monitoring solution to identify and enforce your infringements as you find them is going to be important to that triangle balancing act. Fake and infringing domains can be identified through a combination of things. CSC's new 3D monitoring product helps us detect a wide range of brand variants, including fuzzy matches, homoglyphs, and if you're not familiar with homoglyphs, it's where they have look-alike character sets that may be substituted for a legitimate Latin character set, and then that makes it confusing for the end user. And then, of course, the usual components of internet monitoring, anti-phishing, fraud protection, and the like. We want to make sure that you balance everything out. You can't register everything, so having that combination effect is going to give you the balance you need. So when we look at how to mitigate the risks, there's outward factors, like we saw in the last slide where we're looking at third-party infringements and balancing everything out a little bit that way. But we also have to look inside the portfolio. So inside the fence is where we're going to be looking at the core and critical domains within your portfolio, things that run your email, things that run your core websites and your web content, anything that you're using on your internal intranet. Those are all risk factors that you can have a look at, and they're exposed to a variety of different attack vectors as well. So these are some of the key components for security hygiene that you may want to consider when it comes to those domains. I'm not going to go through all the pieces. You can have a look at the slide later on at your own leisure, but some of the key components, of course: DNS hosting redundancy, making sure that you've got your uptime, and then, of course, helps to mitigate DDoS attacks. Looking at email security, SPF, DMARC, DKIM, all of those factors can come into play to make sure that you've got email authentication standards in place. Things like CAA records that'll ensure that if SSL certificates are being authorized for your domains, that it's your preferred vendors that are getting in there. And then, of course, using an enterprise class registrar. Now, David had spoken earlier a little bit about the key registrars that factored into the fake registrations as being consumer class. And really, when using an enterprise class registrar, they've taken the time, like CSE, to invest in some of the advanced business practice capabilities, expertise, support staff, DNS management, security, fraud protection, and the like. It really is just a basic one-stop shop. Multi-lock is the other angle that's going to be there for you as well. This is a registry lock scenario whereby we take some of the automation out of the process, and it helps really to prevent unauthorized changes to the records and the DNS associated with your core and critical domains. Should, by chance, your credentials be phished or compromised in some way, this sort of locking mechanism will help prevent those sorts of changes from happening and taking your sites offline. So in the previous couple of slides, we were looking at external and internal risk factors and how to mitigate some of those risks. But how do you fare against your peers in the marketplace? Well, CSC does an annual domain security report, and with that, we're looking at the Global Forbes 2000 companies. So these are the elite companies within the marketplace area. And what we're finding from that report, we've got three key factors here on the screen. 81% of these companies are at greater risk of domain and DNS hijacking because they're not adopting some of the basic domain security measures, like DNS redundancy and using an enterprise-level DNS provider. All of those factor into that poor score. And we're also looking at about 60% of these companies are relying on consumer-grade registrars. And as we mentioned in a couple of the previous slides, you know, the consumer-grade registrars typically are low-cost because they rely solely on automation. They're not staffed, they're not equipped, they don't have the resources to handle some of the more complex attack vectors. DNS hijacking, DDoS, man-in-the-middle attacks, those sorts of things are just not on their radar. They're just not equipped to be able to handle those. And that's why we certainly would push people towards an enterprise-level registrar such as CSC. And only half of them are using DMARC records as an email authentication methodology. And as we mentioned before, I mean, there's SPF, TXT. Those are kind of the lower-end basic model records that'll get you by. But DMARC is kind of the Cadillac version of that in order to be able to make sure that people aren't spoofing you online and trying to imitate you in an email situation. So when we look at the Forbes 2000 list and the data that comes out of that, part of that report also takes into consideration where we group the companies into different industry categories. So there's about 27 industry classifications in the original F2000 report, but the CISA classifications only has 16. So CISA stands for Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Wow, I'm not going to say that fast too many times. Now, they operate under the Department of Homeland Security in the U.S., and it's just a very new component. It's been brought in with President Trump a few years back, and one of their first directives was drawing attention to the weakness of the DNS overall. Now, like I said, CISA has 16 different categories. So what we've done is we've rejigged a lot of the data to be able to accommodate those 16 groupings. And you can see from this slide here, the components for, or the categories for baby formula and semiconductors are at the very bottom, unfortunately, of this pile. So when we look at different things like information technology and commercial facilities, they're in the moderate category, but nobody's really in that optimal end, unfortunately. And so, with that in mind, what we want to do from this slide is just show the extent or lack thereof of adoption of domain security measures by each industry sector. And again, seeing where you fare in comparison to your peers. So let's move on now to some of the key takeaways. And for that, I'm going to hand you back over to David.
Thanks so much, Quinn. Right, so overall, supply chain attacks, they will take advantage of weak links in the network of a brand owner's suppliers and vendors. And the reason they're doing that is as a route to compromise corporate systems and basically do damage to that brand. The attack vectors can take a number of different forms, and we can sort of term these what we might think of as direct attacks. So that will be things like DDoS attacks, DNS attacks, domain hijacking, and so on. So the sorts of things that can be protected by domain security measures. And then other types of attacks, things like indirect attacks, so phishing, business email compromise, malware distribution, and so on. And other types of brand infringement. And as we've seen, that can include things like counterfeiting, the types of things that can be tackled more through brand monitoring. But both of those latter two categories can incorporate the use of fake domains, like the ones we've seen in the study. Considering the baby formula and the semiconductor industry specifically, really there's sort of three main things to take away from the study that we looked at. Firstly, that the surges in fake domain registrations that we see tend to follow these real-world supply chain issues. So really when a brand is vulnerable, that's when the bad actors will attack. Many of the fake domains that they use for these attacks are seen to have redacted WHOIS records as a way to sort of hide ownership identity and or have active MX records, and that's obviously key if they're going to be used for their email functionality. And the final point to take away really is that consumer-grade registrars are most frequently used for these registrations. So as we've seen, these risks can be mediated via a combination of really two things. So first of all, the first element is a robust brand protection program, and that will encompass things like domain monitoring, brand monitoring, fraud protection or anti-phishing, and so on. And really what that's doing is that's addressing infringing third-party activity. But that really needs to be combined with a strong domain security posture, and that will allow a brand owner to defend their own official corporate domains. And really, as we've seen in Quinn's section, the extent of the adoption of these measures by many top companies across different critical infrastructure industry sectors is often only poor to moderate at best. And really the final sort of point to sort of take away on that is that this can have impacts on the cyber insurance industry and the premiums that companies need to pay to actually protect themselves from these risks. Because the security postures are generally quite poor, that actually will affect the industry as a whole and the premiums that need to be paid.